I've spent most of my life chasing the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, the kind that hums beneath your skin, that makes your breath sound too loud and your thoughts feel too small. My name's Aaron, 34 years old, born in a small town skirting the edge of the Appalachian Mountains. I've been camping since I was old enough to walk, and by now, I've learned that these mountains hold memories much older than us. Stories that breathe through the trees and whisper in the wind if you listen long enough. I never used to believe those old stories the locals told, not until the trail camera incident, the one that changed the way I look at every rustling leaf and every flicker of shadow that crosses the dirt path ahead. It started simple. My friend Matt and I had taken a few days off to hike an unmarked trail behind Coldwater Ridge, a place few people bother to visit anymore. We'd heard about it from an old ranger who said the trail had been decommissioned after a rock slide about a decade ago, but if we were careful, we could still make our way through to a clearing that overlooked the valley. He said it was one of the last untouched spots around there. No tourists, no light pollution, just the forest and you. That was all I needed to hear. We packed light, hammocks, rations, a small fire kit, and my trail camera, which I always set up for fun. Usually it caught nothing more than deer, raccoons, or the occasional fox padding through in the night. But that trip, it caught something I can't explain. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, a crisp wind cutting through the scent of pine and damp moss. We hiked for hours without seeing another soul. Not a single set of boot prints on the ground, no signs of old campfires, not even a beer can or a broken branch that didn't look natural. The woods felt untouched, but also strangely expectant, like the air was waiting for something. When night came, we set camp in a small clearing near a fallen oak. Matt strung up the hammocks while I unpacked the trail camera and placed it facing our little campsite, angled toward the slope we'd climbed earlier that day. I remember checking the lens, adjusting it carefully. I wanted to catch the time lapse of the night sky, the stars threading through the black canopy above us. It's funny how the forest changes at night. Everything you trust in daylight becomes something else. The wind sounds like whispers. The trees creak like they're breathing. Even your own footsteps seem to follow you. But that night was calm, eerily calm. We stayed by the fire for hours, talking about old hikes, bad weather, and close calls. Matt joked that if anything was going to get us out there, it'd be a black bear or maybe one of those feral hogs that roam the deeper woods. We laughed, but the kind of laugh you use to cover something uneasy, because both of us had heard the ranger's tone when he'd told us not to stay too long near that ridge. Around midnight, the forest went completely still. No wind, no insects, no movement at all. Even the fire seemed to quiet down. I remember glancing at Matt and he looked back at me, both of us frozen. It wasn't fear yet. It was that subtle realization that something wasn't right. The stillness held for maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then, from somewhere far up the slope, came a sound. Not an animal, not a branch, but something like a single footstep pressing into wet leaves. Slow, heavy, measured. Matt reached for his flashlight, but I stopped him. "Wait," I whispered, because in moments like that, light isn't safety. It's a beacon. We listened, but the sound didn't come again. After a while, the forest came back to life. Crickets chirping, wind sighing through the trees, and we convinced ourselves it was nothing. A branch falling. Our minds playing tricks. That's what you do out there. You rationalize, you explain things away because the alternative means you might not sleep at all. We turned in for the night, and I remember closing my eyes with the soft hum of the woods around me, trying to match my breath to the rhythm of the forest. The next morning was as normal as any other. Damp air, faint mist curling through the trees. We packed up early to make it to the overlook before noon. I retrieved the trail camera, checked the battery, and saw the little red light blinking. It had recorded something overnight. That was expected. I slipped it into my pack, and we hiked the rest of the morning, reaching the ridge by midday. The view was unreal. The valley stretching below, mist burning off the treetops, the horizon rippling with blue and green. We stayed up there until late afternoon, and it felt like the kind of peace you search for all your life. But that peace didn't last long. It wasn't until we got back home that I looked at the footage. I was sitting alone in my apartment, a beer on the table, the camera card plugged into my laptop. At first, it was normal, a time lapse of the stars moving overhead, the fire flickering, Matt walking past the lens before settling into his hammock. Then the night deepened. Around the time we heard that sound, the footage froze for just a moment, a flicker, like static. I thought maybe the battery was dying. But then, for a few frames, something appeared behind us. Not close, maybe 30, 40 feet back near the slope, a shape, tall, motionless. It wasn't there one frame and then it was, like it stepped into existence. It looked human, almost. Broad shoulders, a long outline, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too still. The way it stood, it didn't look curious or aggressive. It looked aware, watching. The camera caught it standing there for a few seconds, then another flicker, and it was gone. I replayed that part again and again, zooming in until the pixels broke apart. My hands were shaking, because I remembered the sound we'd heard. One step, like something had stopped, realizing it had been seen. I called Matt, told him to come over, but by the time he did, I'd gone through the footage so many times I couldn't tell if I was still seeing it right. We sat in silence, the glow of the laptop washing our faces, pale. He didn't say a word, just rewound the footage, played it again, slower. Then he said quietly, "That's the spot I saw something move before the fire went out." He hadn't told me that, said he didn't want to freak me out at the time. The days after that were strange. At first, we brushed it off as a trick of light, maybe a glitch. But then, little things started happening. My phone would ring and there'd be no one on the line, just faint static like wind through trees. The trail camera, even when I stored it away, would power on by itself. I'd wake up some nights and think I heard footsteps outside my window. Not close, but there. Just enough to remind me of that night's silence. I went back a week later, alone, thinking maybe I could find some logical explanation. I followed the same trail, the same clearing, even found the spot where the camera had caught the shape. The forest looked the same. Still, beautiful, endless. But there was a difference I can't explain. The birds wouldn't come near that part of the ridge. The air felt heavier, charged, and though I didn't see anything, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back from that night, not in body, but in memory. Like the woods themselves had marked me for seeing something I wasn't supposed to. I never showed the footage publicly. People wouldn't believe it, or worse, they'd go looking for it, chasing something that doesn't want to be found. But every time I camp now, I carry that trail camera with me. Not to catch proof, not to expose anything. Just to remind myself that the forest sees us too, that sometimes it watches back. And maybe that's the real lesson. Out there, you think you're the explorer, the conqueror, the one carving your path through nature's quiet. But in truth, you're just a visitor. You walk among old spirits, ancient silences, things that existed long before your stories began. The woods don't belong to you. And if you ever forget that, they'll remind you. Because in the Appalachians, some trails aren't meant to be walked twice. I didn't plan on returning to Coldwater Ridge again. After that night, I told myself I'd had my fill of the unknown, that I'd learned my lesson about chasing the kind of quiet that hides too much. But the truth is, once you've seen something that doesn't make sense, it never really leaves you. It lingers like a shadow burned into the back of your eyes. Every campfire after that, every night in the woods since, I felt its echo. That thing from the camera, that presence, had carved itself into my understanding of what the forest really is. A few months passed before the idea of going back stopped feeling like insanity and started feeling like necessity. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. It was something else, a pull. You can't explain it to people who haven't felt it. It's like the forest calls you by name in a voice that sounds like your own thoughts. You tell yourself you're going for closure, but deep down you know it's not closure you're chasing, it's understanding. So in early autumn, when the air was dry and sharp and the mountains were bleeding red and gold, I packed light again. Just my sleeping bag, a small tent, a single headlamp, and that same trail camera. I didn't tell Matt. I didn't tell anyone. Some things are easier to face when no one else is watching. The trail looked almost the same, but not quite. The forest had changed. The slope where the camera had caught the shape was littered with fallen branches, the ground torn up like something heavy had passed through. The air smelled of iron and rain. And the silence. It was back, that heavy, watchful stillness that presses on your eardrums until you start hearing your own heartbeat louder than the wind. I set up camp before sunset, trying to convince myself that this was just another hike. I built a small fire, roasted a bit of jerky, and talked out loud to fill the quiet. You came here for answers, I told myself. You're not afraid. But the woods don't listen to bravado. The woods remember. When the last light slipped away, I placed the trail camera on the same stump as before, angled toward the slope. I checked the battery twice, and then I waited. No fire this time. I wanted darkness, pure darkness. For hours, nothing happened. Just the wind sighing through the trees, the occasional crack of bark shifting in the cold. Around midnight, I started to drift in and out of light sleep. That's when I heard it, that same single heavy footstep. The same deliberate sound, like something stepping into the world again. My body froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then another step. Closer. Slow. Measured. I reached for the camera remote in my pocket, a small red button that marked clips for later review, and pressed it. The light blinked once, then off. I couldn't see anything. Just blackness, but I could feel it, the weight of something nearby. Like the air itself had grown thicker, the shadows denser. And then, behind me, maybe 20 feet away, a faint sound, almost human, a breath, long, strained, and low. I turned my head just enough to catch movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, tall, motionless again, at the edge of the trees. It wasn't approaching. It was waiting. I wanted to run, but something inside me whispered, "Don't." It wasn't courage. It was recognition. Like I'd been here before in some older memory that didn't belong to me. That thing wasn't hunting. It was remembering. I don't know how long I sat there. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and my mind drifted somewhere between waking and dreaming. When I opened my eyes, dawn was bleeding through the trees, and the forest looked ordinary again. Birds called. Light flickered. Nothing out of place. The trail camera was still running. I took it, packed up, and hiked down in silence. I didn't look back once. When I got home, I didn't even shower. I plugged the card into my laptop, heart pounding. The footage was grainy, static at first, then clear enough to see my tent, the faint outline of my breath in the cold. At midnight, the timestamp flickered, and there, faint but real, was the same shape again. But this time, it wasn't just standing. It turned its head, slowly, toward the camera. The motion was subtle, almost graceful, and when it faced the lens, the footage distorted, like heat waves or interference. You couldn't make out a face, just an impression of something human-shaped, blurred by the distance between what we can understand and what we're not meant to. Then it was gone. But here's the part that haunts me still. As the footage played out, the forest around me, on the screen, seemed to breathe. The branches swayed, though there'd been no wind that night. And just before the clip ended, for a single frame, I could see something faint in the reflection of my tent window. Letters carved or scratched into the fabric. 4 words. Barely visible. You came back alone. I never went camping solo again after that. But sometimes when I'm out there with a group, I still set up the trail camera facing away from camp. I tell everyone it's for wildlife, for fun. But I know better. I'm not watching for what's out there anymore. I'm watching for when it decides to return. There's a lesson buried in that night. Not the kind you find in a book, not something you can quote or put on a mug. It's deeper. It's the kind of lesson that strips away the illusion that we're ever really in control out there. You see, people go into the woods thinking they're chasing peace, solitude, healing. But the woods don't exist for us. They were here long before our maps, our trails, our names for the trees. They don't owe us answers. Sometimes they give us silence, sometimes they give us fear, and sometimes, if we listen close enough, they remind us that not every kind of loneliness needs to be cured. Some of it, the kind that presses against your ribs under the stars, is sacred. It's the voice of something older, reminding you that there are still mysteries left in the world, still places where you're not the biggest thing walking the earth. And maybe that's what the trail camera captured. Not a monster, not a ghost, but the moment a man finally saw himself as he truly is, small, fragile, and deeply outnumbered in a world that doesn't bend for him. So now when I hike those same trails, I don't look for answers anymore. I walk quietly, I listen more. I treat every silence as if it's alive, because somewhere in those woods there's a shape in the distance that doesn't need a name. It's not there to harm or help. It's there to remind you of what you've forgotten, that you're a guest here, and the forest never forgets its guests. 5 years passed before I saw that camera again. I had stored it in a box beneath the rest of my camping gear, buried under coils of rope, a torn sleeping bag, and an old compass that didn't point north anymore. I told myself I'd never use it again. But time has a way of softening fear, reshaping it into curiosity. You start wondering if you imagined it all. If maybe you were just tired or lonely or caught in one of those strange mountain fogs that make your mind play tricks. Then one fall afternoon, I got a message from the Park Service. A ranger named Clark, young guy, maybe late 20s, had found an old trail camera in a weathered storage locker up at Coldwater Ridge. My name was still etched on the back. He'd run the memory card out of habit, and though most of the footage was corrupted, there was one new clip, time-stamped just 3 weeks earlier. That's what made my stomach drop. I hadn't been there in 5 years. I drove up the next day. The park was colder than I remembered, sharper somehow. The leaves had already begun to turn, a mosaic of flame and rust. Clark met me at the ranger station, polite, talkative, but with that nervous tone people use when they can't decide if they're dealing with something serious or ridiculous. He handed me the SD card. "You'll want to see this," he said, hesitating before adding, "Whatever it is, it's not a prank." I waited until I was back in my truck before sliding the card into my laptop. The screen flickered, and there it was, the familiar clearing, the same fallen oak, my old campsite, only the vegetation had grown thick around it. The footage wasn't new. It looked like the camera had somehow reactivated and started recording again. For the first 2 minutes, nothing moved, just the trees breathing, the shifting light. Then, at the far edge of the frame, something stepped into view. Not the tall figure this time. It was me, or someone who looked like me. Same jacket, same posture, same small scar along the neck I'd gotten from a fall years before. The figure moved like I do, careful, methodical, as if retracing a memory. He stopped in the exact spot where I'd set my tent, looked directly into the camera. Then, barely audible through the static, he spoke. The voice was my own. But the words chilled me to the bone. He said, "You shouldn't have come back." Then the image glitched, the frame stretching, the sound bending into something that wasn't quite human. And right before the clip ended, behind the figure, behind me, the outline of that same tall shape appeared again, distant and watching. The feed cut out there. I don't remember driving home. My mind kept looping over that moment, how the figure had looked right into the lens, how it had known what to say, how it had sounded like my voice, but not me. For days, I tried to find a rational answer. Maybe someone had stolen my old footage and edited it, maybe a deepfake, maybe some cosmic joke, but the ranger swore he found that camera locked, untouched, coated with 5 years of dirt and mold. And then came the dreams. In them, I was always standing on that ridge again, only this time, it wasn't night, it was dusk. That hour, when the woods go quiet and the shadows turn red at the edges. I could hear my own breathing, could see my tent ahead of me, but something about the forest was wrong. The trees seemed closer, leaning inward, and from somewhere behind me, a whisper, faint but clear, repeating the same 4 words scratched on my tent years ago. "You came back alone." I started waking up with the smell of pine and wet earth in my room, even though I hadn't been near the woods in months. My boots, the same ones I'd worn on that last trip, began showing fresh mud after nights I hadn't left my house. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it couldn't follow me here. But deep down, I knew that whatever lives in that forest doesn't stay confined by distance. It lives in memory, and memory travels. I thought about throwing the camera away or smashing it. But every time I tried, something stopped me. Not fear, not superstition, something else. A quiet, gnawing respect. Like I was holding something sacred, even if it scared me. One night I decided to turn it back on, just once, to see if it still worked. The red light blinked, just as it always had, steady and calm. I placed it by my window, aimed toward the tree line behind my house, and let it record through the night. The next morning, I checked the footage. The first few minutes were ordinary, wind moving through the pines, a raccoon passing through the yard. Then, around 3 a.m., the frame flickered, the light dimmed, and for just a second the camera caught something, a reflection in the window glass. A face, not the tall shape, not even the doppelganger I'd seen before. It was mine again, only older, worn, eyes hollow and distant, staring straight at me. And as the image pulsed and vanished, I noticed something scratched faintly along the glass of the window itself. We never left. That was when I realized the forest doesn't end at the edge of the trees. It carries with you, breathing through the cracks of your memory, waiting for the quiet to fall. Once you've been marked by its silence, you're never really gone from it. You're just walking somewhere else within its boundaries. Now, every time I drive past a stretch of Appalachian forest, I catch glimpses of it, in the way the fog hugs the tree line, in the movement you almost see out of the corner of your eye. Sometimes I think about stopping, about walking back into those woods and asking the question that's haunted me for years, what are you? But I never do, because deep down, I already know the answer. It's not a thing. It's not a ghost. It's the mountain itself, ancient, patient, and alive, watching, waiting, listening for the ones who dare to come back. And I think it remembers every single name. I went back one last time, not out of bravery, not even out of curiosity. I went because I couldn't stand not knowing anymore, not knowing why me, why that camera, why those words that had followed me from dream to waking life. Some questions, if you don't face them, they rot inside you. They turn every silence into a whisper, every dark corner into a waiting shadow. And so one gray November morning, I packed my bag again, only this time not to camp. This time, I was going to listen. The road to Coldwater Ridge was half swallowed by fog, the kind that rolls in slow and low, crawling through the valleys like it has a mind of its own. I drove with the windows cracked just enough to smell the wet pine, to hear the drip of rain from branches overhead. The forest felt heavy, older than I remembered, like it had grown tired of pretending to be just trees and dirt. When I reached the trailhead, I left the truck running for a moment, staring into that familiar wall of green. The same feeling crept up my spine, that sense of being seen, recognized, like stepping into the house of something ancient that remembers every trespass, every echo of your voice. I turned off the engine. The world fell silent, and I stepped into the woods. Every footstep seemed to stir something. The leaves whispered as if passing my presence along from tree to tree. The air thickened as I neared the old clearing. I expected to find the fallen oak, maybe some trace of my last camp, but the forest had reclaimed everything. The clearing was gone, swallowed by ferns and saplings. Only the ground remembered, soft and uneven beneath my boots. I set the trail camera on a low branch and pressed record. The red light blinked once, steady, waiting. Then I sat on the ground and closed my eyes. No fire, no noise, no movement, just the sound of the wind breathing through the canopy. After a while, the silence began to shift, not grow louder, just deeper. The way a lake looks calm until you realize it has no bottom. I opened my eyes, and there, at the far edge of the clearing, stood the shape. Same as before, tall, still, featureless. But this time, it didn't feel like it was watching me. It felt like it was waiting. My pulse thundered in my ears. My first instinct was to reach for the camera, to catch proof, to make it real, but something in me hesitated. That same instinct that warns you when lightning's about to strike or when a predator's watching from the brush. I knew that if I treated it like a threat, it would become one. So instead, I spoke. "I came back," I said, voice barely more than a whisper. "I want to understand." The air trembled, not from sound but from presence. The trees leaned slightly inward, the wind stilled. The shape tilted its head just slightly, and for the first time I realized what I'd been seeing all along wasn't a thing. It was a reflection, not in the sense of glass or mirror, but reflection as in echo, a shadow of memory, fed by whoever entered this place carrying fear or guilt or longing. It wasn't alive the way we are. It was alive the way the forest is, a memory that breathes. A collection of every voice that ever walked too far into the silence and listened too long. And then I heard it, not out loud, but inside. A voice, my voice, layered with others. "You came back alone." I understood then. It wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. The woods weren't threatening me. They were offering me something, a chance to become part of that silence, to stop wandering, to stop seeking, to stay. For a long time, I didn't move. The wind carried through again, slow and rhythmic, and I realized that the forest's breath had matched my own. I stood, every instinct in me split between running and surrendering, and that's when the shape began to dissolve. Not vanish, dissolve. It broke apart like smoke, like mist, like it had only ever been made of what I'd brought with me. Fear, memory, longing. In its place, just for a heartbeat, I saw something else. Shapes, dozens of them, woven into the trees, the fog, the light, faces half-glimpsed, familiar and not. People who'd walked these trails before me, people who'd gone missing, who'd never come back. Not gone, just taken in. The woods hadn't devoured them, it had kept them, preserved their stories in silence. I stepped closer to where the figure had been, and the air turned warm. The scent of pine and soil filled my lungs, thick and grounding. I felt calm, like standing inside a truth too big to name. The forest didn't want to harm. It wanted to remember, and it wanted me to remember too. When I returned to the truck, the sky had already turned the pale gray of late afternoon. I looked back once, and for the first time I didn't feel watched. I felt acknowledged, like I'd said what needed saying. That night, I checked the footage. The camera had recorded everything, but not the way I'd seen it. No shape, no figure, just me, sitting in the middle of the clearing, speaking to empty air. My voice, faint and distant, saying, "I came back." Then silence. But in the last few seconds of the recording, the lens caught something strange, the faint shimmer of movement, like heat distortion rippling through the trees. Then, carved in the dirt behind me, a message. 4 new words, clear as day. "You may go now." I sat there for a long time, watching the screen glow against the dark of my room. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. Now, whenever I camp, I still feel the forest breathing around me. I still sense that quiet presence, that deep and endless awareness that waits in the spaces between wind and earth. But it doesn't feel like fear anymore. It feels like reverence. Because the truth is, the forest doesn't want to hurt us. It wants us to listen. It wants us to know that every whisper, every rustle, every silence is a story being told. One older than language, older than light. And maybe that's the real secret of the Appalachians. Not monsters, not ghosts, but memory itself. Memory so ancient and alive that it takes shape, watches back, and waits for those who forget that nature isn't a backdrop to our lives. It's the author. I still keep the trail camera. I never erase the footage. Sometimes when I'm alone, I play that final clip just to hear the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the sound that once terrified me, now a kind of hymn. The forest gave me something that night, not answers, but perspective. It showed me that fear isn't the enemy of understanding, it's the beginning of it. And somewhere, deep in those mountains, I know that silence is still waiting, not as a warning, but as a welcome home. They say every forest has a memory, Some whisper it through the trees, others through the silence that falls when the sun dips behind the ridges, but the Appalachian woods, they remember everything. And sometimes they remind you. My name's Ethan Cole. I was 28 when this happened, young enough to think I understood the woods, old enough to believe I respected them. I'd been camping all my life, from Shenandoah's ridgelines to the misted coves of North Carolina, but nothing, not the weather, not the terrain, not even the wildlife, prepared me for what those mountains showed me that night. It started like any other fall trip. My buddy Mason and I packed light, tents, dehydrated food, a compass, and that naive confidence you carry when you think the forest is still your friend. We stopped in a small town near the Tennessee border to grab gas and supplies, the kind of place that time forgot, a single diner, a general store, and people who looked at you a second too long before they smiled. Inside the diner, a woman with gray hair tied back in a bandana poured us coffee. She asked where we were headed, and Mason, ever the talker, said proudly, "We're camping up near Pine Hollow. Maybe push up past the ridge if the weather holds." Her hand froze mid-pour. "You boys don't hike past sundown," she said flatly. "Not past the ridge, you hear me?" Mason laughed it off, said something about ghost stories and overprotective locals. But I noticed how her expression didn't change. She just nodded once, slow, like she'd said what she needed to say. When we left, she called after us, "If you hear something calling your name, don't answer." I laughed too, then. I shouldn't have. By late afternoon, we'd hiked 6 miles into the hollow. The light broke in slanted gold shafts through the trees, the air thick with that mossy, damp sweetness only deep forest carries. It was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that makes you keep checking behind you, like the woods are listening. We set camp near a creek, the water dark and cold, running slow over stones that looked older than time. Mason started a small fire, humming while I gathered kindling. It felt normal enough, except for that creeping sense that something was just beyond sight. A branch snapped once, and I turned so fast I nearly dropped the wood. Nothing there, just the shadow of a birch shifting in the wind. By the time the sun dipped, the forest went still. No crickets, no frogs, even the creek seemed quiet. We sat close to the fire, pretending not to notice. Mason joked about how mountain lions hunt in silence, then grinned like he didn't believe it himself. I remember thinking how strange the air felt, heavy like the woods were holding their breath. And then we heard it, a voice. At first it sounded like wind, then clearer. My name, drawn out, soft, almost questioning. "Ethan." I looked at Mason, expecting him to smirk, to admit it was him playing a trick. But he was pale. The firelight flickered across his face, and his lips barely moved when he whispered, "You heard that too?" We didn't move for a long time. I tried to convince myself it was an echo, some trick of the wind rolling through the valley. But the voice came again, closer this time. Same tone, same rhythm, Ethan. It came from beyond the creek, where the dark had already swallowed the trees whole. Mason stood. "It's probably someone messing around," he said, but his voice cracked halfway through. He grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the woods. The beam barely pierced the first few feet before dissolving into black. And then we saw it. A figure, tall, still, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its outline wrong somehow, like it didn't quite fit the space it was in. Mason whispered, "Hey, you all right out there?" No answer, just silence. Then the voice again, only this time it sounded like me. Same pitch, same drawl. "Hey, you all right out there?" Every nerve in my body went cold. Mason dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground, beam spinning, and for half a second I swear I saw the thing move, not walk, not step, but shift, like a frame in a broken film, closer than before. We didn't say a word. We just ran, the fire, the gear, the creek, gone behind us in seconds. The forest blurred around us as we tore through the brush, the only sound our own breathing and the cracking of branches underfoot. And somewhere in the chaos, behind us, it called again, both our names now, one after the other, like it was testing the sound of them. We didn't stop until the trees thinned and the moonlight broke through. When we finally collapsed near the ridge, Mason looked back and whispered, "Do you see it?" And I did. Down in the hollow, where our campfire still burned weakly, that figure stood again. But this time it wasn't alone. Shapes, 4, maybe 5, moved among the trees, all too tall, too still, just watching. We huddled there until dawn, shaking, whispering prayers neither of us really believed in. When the light finally broke, the forest looked different, normal again, peaceful, like nothing had happened. We went back for our gear in daylight. Everything was exactly where we'd left it, except for the fire. It hadn't burned out. The wood was still warm, still smoldering, like it had just been tended minutes before. When we made it back to town, the same woman was outside the diner sweeping the steps. She looked up when she saw us, like she'd been waiting. "You went past sundown, didn't you?" I nodded. I didn't have words. She just sighed. "They don't mean harm if you don't answer," she said quietly. "They only come close when you do." That night replayed in my head for months, the sound of my own voice echoing back from the dark, the way the woods went silent, the way they stood there like they'd always been part of that place long before us. And I realized something. Those warnings from the locals, they weren't superstition. They were respect. Generations of people who learned that the forest isn't ours, not really. It lets us walk its trails, breathe its air, sleep under its stars, but it doesn't belong to us. That night taught me what every camper, every hiker, every wanderer in those mountains should understand. The wild doesn't need to roar to show its power. Sometimes it just listens and waits for you to forget that you're the visitor. Now, every time I camp out there, I stop before sundown. I sit by the fire listening to the wind through the pines, and I think about that voice, the way it said my name, curious, patient, almost human, and I never answer. Because in the Appalachians, silence isn't empty. It's sacred. It's a warning. And once you hear your own voice calling back from the dark, you never mistake the woods for just trees again. I used to think silence was a friend. Out there, miles from any road or cell signal, silence was peace. But after that night, I understood. Silence can also be the forest's way of watching you, measuring whether you belong. When I got home, I tried to explain it to people. Friends laughed it off, said we must have been exhausted, dehydrated, maybe even half asleep. They said the brain does strange things when it's scared. Mason stopped hiking entirely after that. He moved to Colorado for work and never talked about Pine Hollow again. I didn't blame him. There's a kind of fear that lingers, not the kind that jumps out at you, but the kind that hums in your bones whenever the wind shifts through trees. A few months later, I went back, alone this time. It wasn't bravery that sent me, it was something else, something I still can't name. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that the woods hadn't changed, that I could still walk those trails without feeling that weight pressing down on my chest. When I parked at the edge of the same trailhead, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was an old wooden sign, half rotted, tucked into the brush. The letters were faded, but I could still read them. Trail closed after dusk, by order of the county. But the funny thing was, there wasn't a county listed. No seal, no date, nothing official. Just that one warning. The air felt different, even in daylight. Still, I walked. The forest welcomed me the way it always does at first, with birdsong, the steady crunch of leaves underfoot, the smell of pine resin thick in the air. But as the sun dipped lower, that same hush started to fall again. And for a moment, I almost turned back, but something made me stop at the ridge where Mason and I had spent that night, the one where we'd watched the figures move below. The valley stretched out beneath me, quiet and endless, the treetops burning gold in the last light. Then I saw it. Down in the hollow, a thin line of smoke rose, just like before. A campfire in the exact same spot where ours had been. I should have run, but I didn't. I started down the slope, one careful step at a time, my flashlight still off. The closer I got, the colder it felt, like walking into a memory you wish you could forget. When I reached the clearing, the fire was there. Steady, warm, alive. But there was no one around it, just two sets of footprints in the dirt. My footprints, Mason's, perfectly preserved like they'd been made yesterday. And then from across the creek, I heard it again. Ethan. Only this time, it wasn't my voice. It wasn't even close. It was lower, slower, carrying something that felt ancient, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. I stood there, staring into the dark. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. And then it spoke again, softer, like it was trying to remember how to form the words. Why did you come back? The fire flickered. The trees leaned closer. I didn't answer. God knows I wanted to, but I remembered what the woman at the diner said. They only come close when you do. So I turned. And as I climbed back toward the ridge, I felt it, the woods shifting around me like they were closing ranks. No wind, no sound, no movement. Just a quiet that pressed against my ears so hard it hurt. When I finally broke through the tree line, the world opened up again. The sky was bleeding orange and purple, and the air was warm, filled with life. I didn't stop walking until I reached my truck. And when I looked back one last time, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've talked to locals, rangers, even old-timers who've lived their whole lives in those hills. Most just shake their heads when I mention Pine Hollow. Some make the sign of the cross. One man, a retired ranger, finally told me what he'd heard, that long before those trails were marked, before settlers ever built roads through the Appalachians, that valley was known to the Cherokee as the place where the voices dwell. He said it wasn't ghosts, not in the way we think. It was something older. The forest itself, mimicking what it remembers, the sounds of the living replayed in the dark. A warning, or maybe a reminder, that the mountains don't forget. I think about that often, because the truth is, the forest didn't chase me out that night. It didn't harm me, it let me leave. And maybe that's what scares me most, that whatever's out there chose to let me go. Now, whenever I camp, I carry that silence with me. I pitch my tent before sundown, always facing east, so I can see the first light in the morning. I still light a fire, but I never let it burn past midnight. And when the woods go quiet, that deep, breathless quiet that feels like the whole world is waiting, I whisper thank you. Not to the air, not to the sky, but to whatever watches from the dark. People ask me sometimes why I still go, why I still hike, still sleep under trees that have seen things older than memory. I tell them it's because the woods remind me of who I am. Small, fragile, temporary. They remind me that respect isn't just a feeling, it's survival. Out there, you learn the truth most people never do. Nature doesn't need your belief to be powerful. It doesn't need to prove it can end you. It just waits, patient and eternal, for you to forget your place. And every time I step back into those mountains, I remember that night, the voice calling my name, the figures by the creek, the fire still burning when it shouldn't have been. I remember the warning, don't hike past sundown. And I finally understand what it really meant. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect. Because when the sun sinks and the last light fades behind the Appalachian ridges, the forest wakes up in ways we'll never fully understand. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of our lanterns and flashlights, the voices are still waiting, calling out to anyone who dares to forget the rules. So if you ever find yourself deep in those woods and the air starts to still and the silence feels alive, stop, listen. And if you hear your name whispered softly from the dark, don't answer. Not everything that calls to you in the mountains wants you to find your way home. I remember the night we got lost like it's burned into the walls of my memory. You don't forget something like that. The sound of your own breath echoing in the dark, the way the forest closes around you when it realizes you don't belong there anymore. My name's Eli Parker. I was 27 back then, a weekend camper who thought he knew the woods because he'd walked a few trails and read a few maps. That night in the Appalachians taught me otherwise. It was late October, just as the leaves had turned to rust and flame. The air had that sharp smell of rot and pine that only comes right before the first frost. My buddy Mason and I drove up to a clearing near the Blue Ridge, planning to hike a small loop trail that was supposed to reconnect with our base camp before sunset. But the forest had other plans. We'd been told by a local at the gas station that the trail could get confusing after dark. Follow the reflective markers, he'd said. They'll guide you back to the lot. Simple enough, we thought. We had flashlights, compass, GPS, everything a couple of weekend wanderers could need. But there's something strange about those hills. Once you step off the main trail, the forest begins to change its shape. What looks like a path 1 minute disappears into a web of deer tracks the next. The light fades quicker there too, as if the sun has to fight its way through the thick, gnarled canopy. By the time the sky started dimming to purple, we'd gone too far. We should have turned back hours before, but we were chasing something we couldn't name. A kind of quiet, a kind of proof. You never realize how loud civilization is until you find yourself deep enough that even your own footsteps sound intrusive. The deeper we went, the more those reflective markers caught our attention. Small, metallic dots on trees, glinting faintly in our headlamps. At first, they felt like a lifeline. They meant direction, order, safety. But later that night, those same markers became the reason we almost didn't make it out. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mason noticed the same crooked pine twice. It had a split trunk that looked like a serpent's tongue, something you couldn't mistake. "We've been here already," he said, his voice too calm for what he was realizing. I didn't want to believe it. I told him the woods just looked similar, that our minds were playing tricks under the dim light. But when we found a discarded granola wrapper near the base of that same tree, the one Mason had dropped earlier, it hit me. We weren't following a trail anymore. We were walking in circles. The markers were still there, though, bright as ever, almost too bright when the flashlight hit them. They beckoned us, one after another, deeper into a darkness that felt unnatural. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a pattern. Every 50, maybe 60 feet, another gleaming dot, always leading left, always slightly downhill. I remember how Mason started counting steps between them, muttering under his breath, trying to prove there was some kind of logic. But the deeper we followed, the more disoriented we became. Our compass needle twitched and stuttered, pointing nowhere steady. My GPS flickered out. Low battery, it claimed. We both knew it wasn't just the battery. It's hard to describe how silence feels when you're surrounded by thousands of trees. It's not empty. It's dense. You start hearing things that might not be there. The snap of a branch, a whisper that could be the wind, or something else entirely. At one point, I thought I heard a voice behind me, low and dragging, like someone trying to catch a breath. Mason froze too. We swung our lights around, but there was nothing. Just trees. And yet I swear I saw a glint, another reflector, but higher this time, too high to be on a tree trunk. Almost like something was holding it. We tried shouting. Our voices didn't travel far. They just bounced back, muted, like the forest didn't want them. The markers led us to a slope where the ground was damp and soft. Our boots sank slightly with each step, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Then, Mason's flashlight flickered out, total black. We scrambled to relight it, panic scraping at our throats. When it came back on, we saw something that made both of us go silent. The next marker was nailed not to a tree, but to a piece of wood sticking up from the ground, like part of a post. A grave marker, maybe. We stood there for a long time, too long. I remember how the woods seemed to listen to us, waiting. I told Mason we should turn around, but he shook his head. If we backtrack, we'll just keep looping. We have to break off. He pointed in a direction that had no markers, no path, just pure black forest. It felt like stepping into water you couldn't see the bottom of, but we did it anyway. We cut off the trail, walking toward the faint sound of running water. The ground sloped sharper, the air colder. Something in me knew this was the right move, though my body trembled the whole time. Eventually, we found a small stream, barely more than a trickle. Streams lead somewhere, I told myself. If we followed it, we'd reach a road or at least a clearing. That logic was all that kept us moving. We followed the water for nearly an hour before we saw light, not the harsh beam of our lamps, but a faint orange glow flickering through the trees. Firelight. Relief hit so hard it almost hurt, but when we got closer, we realized it wasn't a campfire. It was a lantern, an old one, hanging from a low branch, swaying in the wind. Mason reached for it first. "Hello?" he called out, but there was no answer. The forest stayed still. The lantern burned steady, its flame barely moving even in the cold wind. I remember the shape of it, rusted metal, glass smudged with soot. Underneath it, the ground was disturbed, like something had been dug up and then covered again. I felt the back of my neck tighten. That's when I saw another reflective marker, right beside the lantern, nailed to the same tree. But this one was bent, scratched, dulled, almost angry-looking compared to the others. That was the moment I knew we weren't just lost. Someone had put those markers there, but not for hikers. They weren't meant to guide, they were meant to mislead. We backed away, careful not to make noise. Mason whispered, "Someone's out here." His voice trembled. We turned off our lights and stood still in the dark. And that's when we heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Not animals, not echo. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. We ran. No plan, no direction. Just pure instinct. Branches whipped our faces, roots caught our feet, and every breath burned. Behind us, the footsteps kept pace, never rushing, never faltering. We didn't stop until the stream widened into a shallow pool where the moonlight hit the surface like glass. We crouched there, trying to listen, trying to breathe quietly. After a long while, the sound faded. We waited even longer, afraid to move. When the woods finally fell still again, we followed the stream downstream until we stumbled onto a dirt road. When the ranger found us at dawn, we were barely coherent. He told us that trail had been closed for over a year due to landslides. The reflective markers, those weren't official trail markers. They were part of an old search and rescue route from a missing hiker case, one that was never solved. The lantern? No one could explain it. That night left something in me, a kind of caution that never really fades. Now, whenever I hike, I don't just look for where the trail leads. I look for what it's trying to tell me. Because sometimes the forest doesn't want you to follow. Sometimes it wants to test whether you'll find your own way out, even when everything familiar turns against you. The woods aren't cruel. They're honest. They'll strip you down to what's real, your fear, your will, your instincts. You learn who you are when there's no road left, no signal, no map. You learn that sometimes the only way forward is to stop following the things that shine the brightest. I didn't go back into the woods for nearly a year after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those reflective markers shining through the dark like eyes waiting in silence. Sometimes I'd hear the soft scrape of boots on dirt that weren't mine. Sometimes I'd dream about the lantern, how its flame stayed still, how it didn't flicker even though the wind had been howling. Fear changes shape when you survive it. It stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something that lives in you, quiet and watchful, reminding you what it costs to forget that nature doesn't owe you safety. Mason never talked much about it. We tried once, over beers, months later. He said it didn't make sense, the way the compass spun, the way the markers always looped left. He said maybe we'd been disoriented, maybe exhaustion had twisted our perception. I wanted to believe him. I said I wanted to think it was just human error. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The woods are full of stories, old ones. Some of them aren't written down anywhere, but they hang in the air, passed between locals, whispered around campfires, and once you've been out there long enough, you start to feel that the forest remembers things that people have forgotten. When I finally went back, it was spring. The world was green again, new, alive, forgiving. I told myself I needed to face it, to see the place in daylight, to prove it was just woods and not some nightmare stitched into the soil. I found the ranger who'd helped us that night. He was an older man named Harlan, the kind who spoke slow and watched your eyes when he talked. I asked him if he remembered the search and rescue team that had used those markers. He nodded, but there was hesitation behind it. They were looking for a man. he said. A hiker who went missing in '09. Left his camp just before dusk, said he saw lights in the woods. Never came back. That man had been following the same markers we did. They found his pack, his shoes, even his flashlight, but not him. And the strange part? The markers weren't supposed to be there anymore. After the search ended, the rangers removed them, or thought they did. I walked the edge of that trail again just to see. The new growth had covered most of it, but a few trees still bore faint scars, small round holes where nails had once been. The air felt normal in daylight, almost ordinary. But when I reached the spot where the ground dipped, where the air grew colder even under sunlight, I stopped. There was no lantern now, no sign of disturbance, just a patch of moss, soft and damp beneath my boots. For a moment, I thought maybe the forest was giving me back my peace. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just a faint glint, barely visible between the leaves. A tiny scrap of metal wedged deep in the bark of a tree. A fragment of a reflector, bent and rusted, like it had been waiting for me to find it. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had spoken to me in its own way. Not through voices or shapes or fear, but through memory. It was as if the woods were reminding me that every trail has two stories. The one you walk and the one that walks you. The first you can map, trace, and share. The second, you only feel. It moves behind you, beside you, in the rhythm of your breath and the crunch of your boots. Since then, I've gone deeper into the mountains than I ever thought I would. Alone, sometimes. Cautious, always. And I've learned something that I wish I could have told myself that night in the dark. The forest doesn't test you because it hates you. It tests you because it knows how small you are, and it wants you to see it too. Once you understand that, the fear doesn't leave, but it changes. It becomes respect. There's a silence in those hills that humbles you. The kind that makes you realize how much noise you carry inside. Out there, you learn to listen differently. You start hearing things you never noticed. The rhythm of the wind, the low groan of trees shifting in the soil, the heartbeat of water running beneath stone. And somewhere in that stillness, you understand that being lost isn't always the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes it's the only way to learn the difference between following and being led. I still camp in the Appalachians. I still walk alone sometimes, even when the trails fade to nothing but instinct. But now I don't chase the reflective things. I look for the steady ones, the fixed stars, the sound of running water, the feel of the ground beneath my boots. I know better now that not every light in the woods is meant to guide you home. Some lights are there to see if you've learned how to find home on your own. Every so often, when I'm deep enough into the wilderness that my phone goes silent and the only company I have is the hum of the forest, I think about that night, the loops we walked, the voice I thought I heard, the lantern that burned without wind. And I wonder, what if the forest wasn't trying to scare us at all? What if it was trying to teach us to stop looking for the easy way out? The woods have a language older than any map or trail marker. You feel it in your bones when the sun dips and the mist rolls through the trees. It whispers that not everything shining in the dark is salvation. Some things glimmer just to remind you how easily we mistake direction for destiny. So when you find yourself lost, out there or anywhere, don't panic. Don't follow blindly. Stop. Listen. The forest will tell you everything you need to know if you're quiet enough to hear it. Because in the end, the lesson was simple. Those reflective markers didn't lead us in circles. We did that ourselves, trusting what glittered instead of what grounded us. The forest just showed us the truth, and sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. Yeah, I'd like to say that night faded with time, that I stopped thinking about it once the days got long again and the air smelled like spring. But it never really left. Nights in the woods still sound different now. Not louder, not quieter, just aware. Every rustle feels like it's waiting for a response. Every breeze feels like it's carrying a story. Sometimes, when I camp alone, I'll wake up before dawn. The fire's gone cold and the forest sits still, holding its breath before sunrise. That's when it comes back, that feeling from the Appalachian night. The sense that something out there is watching, not with malice, but with patience. Like the woods are reminding me that they existed long before me and will exist long after. That I'm just passing through, a flicker in their memory. I've started leaving small offerings when I camp now, not out of superstition, but out of respect. A stone stacked on another. A branch laid neatly beside a fallen log. It's my way of saying I'm here, but I know this isn't mine. I've met locals who do the same, people who've lived their whole lives near these mountains. They say the forest doesn't forget who listens. Maybe that's why I feel calm there now, like the fear has been replaced with a quiet kind of trust. But I'll tell you something, I never follow reflective markers anymore. Not on trees, not on old trails, not even the kind meant for safety. There's something about that cold gleam in the dark that feels too much like false hope. I've learned to rely on the sound of running water, on the direction of the wind, on the way moss grows thickest on the northern side of trees. Nature has her signs, but they're not made of metal. They're living, breathing, honest. Every hiker who's been lost knows there's a moment when the panic breaks. When you stop running and realize that the forest isn't trying to trap you, it's trying to slow you down, to make you pay attention. The first time I understood that, I was kneeling beside a stream, watching the current slide over rocks, slick with moss. The sound was soft, steady, like a voice that had been talking all along. I'd just been too loud to hear it. That's when it hit me. Maybe the circles we walked that night weren't just in the woods. Maybe they were inside us. The endless looping of fear, control, and pride. We thought we were explorers, but we were just wanderers refusing to admit we were lost. The forest had to break us down to show us that truth, to humble us. You don't come back from something like that unchanged. Mason and I drifted apart after that trip, not out of anger, just distance. He said he wanted to forget, but I think some part of him never could. For me, it became a quiet obsession. I started reading about old rescue operations, unsolved disappearances, folklore tied to the Appalachians. You'd be surprised how many stories start the same way, with lights in the trees. Always just a few steps off the main trail, always where the land dips and the air grows still. Some say it's tricksters, or the ghosts of the lost, or the forest reclaiming what's hers. I don't pretend to know, but I know this. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Some are meant to remind us that the world still holds things we can't explain, and maybe that's what keeps it sacred. The mountains don't scare me anymore, not like they used to. Now, when I hike through those shadowed valleys and hear the wind threading through the branches, I feel something close to gratitude. The forest took me apart that night, but it gave me something in return, a sense of scale, of reverence, of knowing my small place in something infinite. And sometimes if I'm walking at dusk and the path starts to fade, I'll see a glint ahead, just a trick of the light on a wet leaf or a shard of quartz in the dirt. It'll catch my eye, bright, tempting. And for a heartbeat, I'll remember that night, the way we followed those markers deeper and deeper, thinking we were being guided. Then I'll look away, breathe deep, and keep walking in the dark, trusting the forest instead of what shines. Because the truth is, we're all walking through woods of our own making, each of us following something reflective, comfort, memory, pride, fear, thinking it'll lead us out. But sometimes you have to stop chasing what glitters and start trusting what's real. The wind, the earth, the silence, the things that don't lie. The forest taught me that. It taught me that survival isn't about finding the way out. It's about learning to stand still, to listen, to recognize when the light you're chasing isn't meant for you. And that's why to this day, when I hike alone and the dark settles in and my lamp flickers against the trees, I whisper the same words under my breath. A promise, a reminder. I won't follow what shines. I'll follow what's true. And somehow, every time, the forest lets me pass. The mountains have a strange way of playing tricks on your sense of direction and your sanity. When the sun dips behind the ridgeline and the mist rolls in, it's not just your compass that starts to spin, it's your thoughts. That night, our GPS told us we were floating somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But we were standing on a rocky slope 5,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper names we didn't know. My name's Andrew Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent more weekends in the Appalachian wilderness than I have in my own living room. I grew up near Boone, North Carolina, a small town where every trail leads to a story, and every local has one they swear is true. I've hiked through storms, slept through howls, and watched fog swallow entire valleys. But nothing, not the bears, not the cold, not the endless nights, prepared me for what happened on Cold Spring Mountain last October. We started the hike later than we should have. It was me, my cousin Tyler, and his friend Josh, who'd never been out past a campground before. The plan was simple: reach the old fire tower by dusk, set up camp, and spend the night watching the lights of distant towns blink like fallen stars. We packed light, too light I realize now, and brought one phone for navigation. A phone that, for reasons I still don't understand, later insisted we were adrift at sea. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on damp leaves and the low murmur of the wind threading through the pines. But as we gained elevation, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, older. Some twisted as if they'd been frozen mid-turn. The sunlight barely touched the ground anymore. Every sound echoed longer than it should have, even the rustle of our jackets. Tyler joked that the woods felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but waiting. I brushed it off. You learn, hiking in the Appalachians, that the mind can twist silence into something alive. But even as I said that, I caught myself glancing behind us. Not because I heard anything, but because I felt something, like the forest was aware of us. Watching, maybe. Judging. By the time we reached the ridge, the sky had started to fade from gold to steel. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. We stopped to check the GPS, just to confirm we were still on track. Tyler pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and frowned. "What the hell?" he muttered. On the map, our little blue location dot pulsed in the middle of a massive blue expanse. Ocean. The label beneath it read North Atlantic. The elevation said 5,042 feet. I laughed at first. Some kind of glitch, I thought. Maybe bad signal. But when Josh opened his phone, the same thing appeared. Different model, same result. It was as if the world itself had misplaced us. Now, logic says don't trust tech in the wild. GPS errors happen all the time. But the air changed in that moment. It got colder, heavier. And when I looked around, the forest didn't look the same anymore. The mist that had been hugging the ridge began to thicken, curling around the trunks like smoke. Visibility dropped fast. Within minutes, the path vanished. We tried retracing our steps, but every turn looked identical. The same dead tree, the same slick boulder. Tyler marked a tree with his knife, just in case. 10 minutes later, we saw the same mark again, from the same angle. That was when the panic started to creep in. We decided to stop moving, set up camp right there until morning. But the wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It came in bursts like whispers, soft and circular. Josh swore he heard someone say his name. When we told him he was just tired, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Then why did you hear it too?" I didn't answer. Because I had. We built a small fire, small because the wood was damp and the air didn't want to take the flame. The smoke hung low, swirling instead of rising. None of us said much after that. The forest seemed to press in closer the darker it got. Every flicker of light made the shadows move. At one point, Tyler took his phone out again. Still ocean. Still 5,000 feet. But the battery icon hadn't dropped a single % in hours. It was frozen. He shut it off and said nothing. We all stared into the fire, trying not to listen to the forest breathing around us. When you're in the woods that deep, your brain starts to invent things. Faces in the trees, footsteps that don't exist. But that night, there were no inventions, just presence, the kind that doesn't care if you acknowledge it or not. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of running water. Not a stream, it was too rhythmic, too strong, like waves crashing. I opened the tent and felt cold mist on my face, heavy and damp. The sound got louder, and for one brief, disorienting second, I smelled salt, sea salt. The forest had vanished into a white wall of fog. Our fire was dead, and in the distance, maybe 20 yards away, I could see a shape, not human, not animal, just tall, still. Its edges blurred like a mirage, but I could see it watching. When I blinked, it was gone. The sound of waves stopped, and the forest came back to life like it had been holding its breath. I didn't wake the others. I just sat there until dawn, staring at the mist as it slowly retreated down the slope. By morning, everything looked ordinary again. Same trees, same ground, same sky. But when Tyler checked his phone, the location still hadn't changed. Ocean, coordinates that didn't exist. We hiked down in silence, not speaking until we reached the gravel road. The moment our boots hit asphalt, both phones corrected themselves. The map jumped back to land, a small blue dot right on Cold Spring Mountain. Battery percentage dropped instantly from full to red. That was 2 years ago. I've gone back since. Not to hike, not to camp, just to stand near the trailhead and watch the tree line. There's something about that mountain that doesn't let go once it's found you. Locals don't go there after dusk. Some say it's because of old mines, pockets of magnetic interference. Others say the mountain remembers those who don't respect it. I don't know which version I believe anymore. What I do know is this. Out there, where the fog swallows your sense of direction and the forest makes its own rules, you learn something about fear. It isn't the fear of being lost, it's the fear of realizing the world isn't as mapped as you thought. That there are places where reality bends, where man's logic doesn't apply, and sometimes your GPS isn't wrong. Sometimes you are in the middle of an ocean, a sea of trees, a tide of silence, and if you're not careful, it might pull you under. A week after we got back, I couldn't shake it. The feeling that something had followed us home, not physically, but in thought, in silence. I'd wake up at night and check my phone, half expecting to see that same map again, blue water stretching endlessly under a blinking dot. I didn't tell anyone, not even Tyler. But I started reading. Old maps, missing person reports, Appalachian folklore. And that's when I learned that Cold Spring Mountain wasn't just any mountain. Locals used to call it the Drowned Ridge. I found the name in a 1960s survey record, scrawled in pencil beside the official title. When I asked around at a diner near the base, the kind of place where everyone's known everyone for 50 years, the old man at the counter looked up from his coffee and said quietly, "You went up there?" His tone wasn't curious, it was warning. He told me that decades ago, before digital maps, surveyors complained their compasses spun wildly near the ridge, like standing over a whirlpool, one wrote. There were stories about radios picking up maritime distress calls from ships that sank hundreds of miles away, others about hikers vanishing for a night and waking up miles from where they'd camped, soaked to the bone no rain had fallen. The locals believed the mountain was cursed, or more precisely, reclaimed. There was an old mining operation deep beneath it, sealed off in the 1940s after a flood broke through a forgotten shaft. Every worker inside drowned. Some said the mountain swallowed them whole. Others swore that when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the water rushing under the ground, carrying whispers with it. That phrase, carrying whispers, stuck with me, because that's exactly what it sounded like the night we camped there. I went back one more time, alone this time, a few weeks later. Not to prove anything, just to see if I could understand. I parked at the base, hiked a few miles up until I reached the point where our GPS had gone haywire. The forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that hums in your chest. When I opened my map app, the dot flickered. It didn't show the ocean this time, but it didn't show the trail either. Just a blank white screen. For a few seconds, I thought my phone froze. Then, faintly, a line began to appear across the display. Not a trail, a horizon, the outline of a wave. I shut it off. I didn't need proof. I'd seen enough. On the hike down, I noticed something I hadn't before: pieces of wood, blackened and splintered, scattered across the slope like bones. They weren't fallen trees. They were remnants of the old fire tower, the one we'd never reached that night. I realized then how close we'd been, maybe 100 yards at most, and still, somehow, we'd been nowhere at all. When I told the story to a forest ranger months later, he listened quietly, didn't laugh, didn't question. When I mentioned the GPS reading the ocean, he nodded and said, "You're not the first." He told me their equipment sometimes picks up what looks like sea level readings in that area. Depth measurements. Could be interference, he said. Could be the iron. Could be something deeper. Then he paused and added, almost to himself, "Or maybe the mountain just remembers what it used to be." That line hit me harder than I expected, because what if he was right? What if the mountain wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by its own history? Water buried beneath stone, movement trapped under time. What if, in some strange way, it was still alive, remembering what it felt like to drown? I started thinking about how often we rely on screens, signals, coordinates, all the little devices that make us believe we know where we are. But standing on that ridge, staring at a phone that insisted we were adrift in an endless ocean, I realized something. We don't really find our way in nature. We're granted it. The forest lets you pass, the mountain lets you climb, the night lets you sleep. And when it decides you've taken too much, it takes something back. Tyler doesn't hike anymore. He sold his gear, moved to a city where the sky glows orange every night and no one can see the stars. Josh pretends it never happened, says it was just fog and bad data, but I know better. I can feel it every time I drive past that stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The air gets thicker, the radio static changes pitch, and my hands grip the wheel without thinking. Sometimes I pull over just to look, to listen. The forest never looks the same twice. I've learned to respect that now. The thin line between where the map ends and the unknown begins. Because the truth is, the wilderness doesn't owe us understanding. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just is. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, that there are places so wild, so ancient, that they can bend reality for a night and remind us how small we truly are. So if you ever find yourself on Cold Spring Mountain, or any ridge where the fog seems too thick, where your GPS starts showing blue instead of green, don't panic. Don't shout. Just listen. Because sometimes the mountain speaks in ways the living can't. And if, by chance, you smell salt on the wind, don't look for the ocean. It's already found you. I didn't go back to the mountains for almost a year after that. Every time I thought about hiking again, I felt the weight of that silence pressing against my chest. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of memory. The kind that listens back. I'd scroll through old photos of my trips, sunsets over ridgelines, tents glowing from within, friends laughing by the fire. But no matter how bright those memories were, they all carried the same undertone. That quiet question that lingered since that night. What did we really walk into? Sometimes I think fear isn't about monsters or shadows or even death. It's about realizing you've stepped into a place that doesn't belong to you, and for a fleeting moment, that place decides to remind you. That realization changed how I see the woods. I used to think of nature as something to conquer, to navigate. Now I see it as something sacred, ancient, something you enter like a cathedral, not a playground. When I finally hiked again, it wasn't to chase fear or adventure. It was to pay respect to the mountain, to the silence, to whatever force had allowed me to walk away that night. There's a line in an old Appalachian song that says, "The mountain don't keep what it don't want." I used to think that meant danger. Now I think it means grace. We're all just visitors here, brief, fragile, moving through a world older than our words. On that first hike back, I went alone again. I chose a different mountain this time, lower, gentler, closer to town. I took only what I needed, a small pack, a compass, and a map I could hold in my hands. No GPS, no screens, just the rhythm of my footsteps and the heartbeat of the forest. As dusk fell, the woods began to glow with that quiet silver light that lives between day and night. I built a small fire and sat beside it, listening. Every crackle of flame, every rustle in the leaves, it all felt connected, like the mountain was breathing with me. For the first time since that night, I felt peace. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A low rush of wind that sounded almost like waves. Not menacing, not close, just distant. A reminder. I didn't panic this time. I just closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to the dark. Because maybe that sound wasn't a warning. Maybe it was an echo. Maybe it was the mountain's way of saying, I remember you too. We spend our lives trying to map everything, the land, the stars, even our own fears. But out there, deep in the Appalachians, you learn that some things can't be mapped. Not because they're invisible, but because they're alive. They shift. They choose when to be seen. And that's what keeps me coming back. Not for the thrill, not for the stories, but for that feeling. The moment when you're standing in the dark, miles from anyone, and the forest hums in a way that tells you you're part of something vast, something that doesn't need you but accepts you for a moment anyway. So, if you ever find yourself out there, far from the lights, and your GPS suddenly stops making sense, don't fight it. Don't rush to fix it. Let yourself be lost for a while. Let the mountain teach you what it means to listen, because sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found on any map. They're found in the quiet moments between fear and awe, where your pulse slows, your breath steadies, and you realize you've stopped trying to own the world. You're finally just in it. And when the wind starts to sound like waves again, soft, rolling, distant, maybe it's not the ocean calling you home. Maybe it's the mountain reminding you that not all who are lost are meant to be found. That night on Cold Spring Mountain taught me something I'll never forget. Not every mystery needs solving. Some are meant to humble you, some are meant to change you, and some, if you're lucky, are meant to carry you, like a tide, back to who you really are. So go ahead, hike past sundown, let the fog swallow the trail, let the night whisper your name. But remember this, when your GPS says you're in the middle of the ocean, 5,000 feet up a mountain, maybe you are. Maybe you're standing where the world folds in on itself, where land and water, time and memory all blur together for a breathless moment. And maybe, just maybe, the mountain is showing you its reflection. The place where fear becomes reverence, where getting lost becomes the only way to truly be found. I still remember the way the fog hung low that morning, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The kind of fog that doesn't just blur the trees, but seems to swallow sound, thought, and reason. My name is Ethan Miles, 34 years old, born and raised just a few hours from the Appalachian spine. I'd spent most of my life hiking its trails, chasing silence where the world feels untouched, where every step feels older than memory. But that week, something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peace anymore. It was anticipation. I'd set out alone that October, a time when the leaves turned to flame and the woods carried that dry, whispering rustle that only comes before winter. My plan was simple. Spend a week section hiking between Hot Springs and Irwin, Tennessee, logging notes for a personal project I'd been calling the Trail Log. It was supposed to be a written record of small encounters, the old shelters, the forgotten stories carved into the wooden beams, the names of those who came before. But I didn't realize that sometimes the trail keeps its own log, one that doesn't care about time or who's still alive to sign it. The first few days went quietly. I passed through stretches of trail where the moss covered everything like a memory trying to hide itself. I camped near an old fire tower the second night, its rusted frame moaning against the wind, the kind of sound that makes you feel like someone's talking far away, but you can't quite catch the words. I found carvings on the wooden railing, dates, initials, the usual declarations of I was here. I added mine, small and careful. It felt almost ceremonial, but as I scraped the knife into the wood, I realized there was already an E-miles carved into the opposite side of the beam. Same handwriting, same cut depth, same curve of the letters. That night, I didn't sleep much. I told myself it was a coincidence. E-miles isn't exactly rare. But the thought gnawed at me, the way your mind loops over something it doesn't understand. I packed up early, before the sun broke the fog. My breath looked like smoke as I walked, and I remember thinking that the trail felt quieter than usual. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of my boots against damp earth and my heart trying to match the rhythm. By the fourth day, I reached an old wooden shelter about a mile off the main path. Most hikers skipped it. It wasn't marked on newer maps anymore. But I wanted solitude. The structure leaned against a slope, dark with age, a small stream running just behind it. Inside, the walls were layered with hiker signatures, dates, drawings. A logbook sat in a tin box near the corner, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. When I opened it, I could smell the mildew, the faint rot of paper that's been through too many seasons. I flipped through the pages, smiling at the notes, some funny, some desperate, some poetic in that way only tired people can be. But then I saw it, a fresh page, my name written clean and sure in black ink. Ethan Miles arrived October 3rd, still here, will be leaving soon. The problem was, I arrived on October 10th. I stared at the page for a long time, tracing the handwriting with my thumb. It was mine. I mean exactly mine. The same slant, the same spacing, the same way I crossed the T a little too long. I flipped back through older entries. None like it. No mention of me, no prank from some friend, no logical thread to pull. I felt my stomach twist in that quiet way where fear doesn't shout, it just waits. That night, I stayed in the shelter anyway. The rational part of me said there was no danger, that maybe I'd seen wrong. Maybe someone was messing around. I tried to eat, to write in my own notebook, but every sound outside made my head jerk up, the pop of wood in the fire, the shifting leaves. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, measured, moving along the path outside. Not heavy like an animal. Human. I froze, hand wrapped around the knife beside my sleeping bag. The steps came closer, paused just at the edge of the clearing. I didn't hear breathing, no voice, just a kind of listening. Whoever or whatever it was stood there long enough that I felt my skin tighten, like the air itself was closing in, and then, just as slow, the steps turned and faded back into the trees. When dawn came, I stepped outside. There were prints in the mud, faint but clear. Boots, the same tread as mine. I followed them for about 20 yards before they just stopped. No scuff, no turn, no drag mark. Just ended in the middle of the trail, like the person had walked out of existence. I remember standing there, heart hammering in my chest, the forest holding that same awful quiet. That's when I decided to leave early. The trail out felt longer than it should have. The fog had rolled back in, thicker now, and I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, me, walking behind. At one point, I passed an old wooden sign, split down the middle from years of rot. Carved faintly into the wood were words I almost didn't notice. The trail remembers. I didn't understand what it meant, not until later. When I finally made it back to the trailhead near Irwin, I signed the official hiker register like always. I flipped through a few pages, curious, maybe even a little desperate to prove that what I saw back there had some explanation. But right near the top, under a week-old date, there it was again. My name, same handwriting, same words. Still here, will be leaving soon. I remember my hands shaking as I held the pen. I didn't sign anything that day. I just left the book open and walked to my truck without looking back. But the strangest part came after I got home. When I opened my own log, the one I'd carried that entire week, there was a page I didn't remember writing. Same words, same date. Ink slightly smudged, like it had been written before the page was dry. And right beneath it, written faintly in pencil, "Welcome back." That night, I burned the logbook, or I tried to. The pages blackened, curled, but the ink, it didn't fade. It stayed visible through the ash, glowing faintly in the dark, like it was written in something that wasn't meant to burn. I still go back to the mountains sometimes. I tell myself I do it for the peace, the air, the feeling of being small in something ancient. But if I'm honest, I think I go because I'm trying to understand what happened out there, whether it was real, or something my mind made to fill the silence. Maybe the trail really does remember. Maybe we leave more of ourselves out there than we realize. The woods have a strange way of holding on to the people who pass through them. You think you're alone, that your footprints fade, your campfire dies, your voice disappears into the pines. But the Appalachians, they keep things. They echo them. Every whisper, every step, every name written down in those damp old books, it all becomes part of the trail's story. And sometimes when the fog drifts low and the world grows still, I think about that entry, about the other me who walked ahead, who signed his name before I even arrived. I wonder if he ever left. Maybe he's still out there, walking the same path, writing the same words, waiting for me to return. And maybe someday soon, when I pick up another logbook deep in those mountains, I'll see my name again. Fresh ink, steady hand, a quiet note that reads, "Welcome back, Ethan. Still here. We'll be leaving soon." I went back the following spring, against every reason, against every instinct that told me to leave the past buried under the weight of the Appalachian fog. But something inside me had never left that shelter. Something had stayed there, pacing the floorboards in the dark. The air was different this time, warmer, gentler, but the mountains still felt heavy. Every time I return, it's like they're waiting for me. I parked near the same trailhead outside Hot Springs. I checked my gear and started walking. My steps felt rehearsed, like muscle memory was guiding me back toward something I'd already done. The same trees, the same bends in the path, the same stretch of quiet where the wind seems to vanish. Halfway up the ridge, I noticed the carvings again, the initials, the small symbols hikers leave behind. Most were new, layered over the old, but one caught my eye, the same E-miles. This time carved deep enough to splinter the wood. I pressed my fingers against it, and the grain felt warm, like the mark hadn't fully cooled. It wasn't old. It had been made recently. That realization hit me in the gut. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, hadn't mentioned which section of the trail, yet somehow my name kept appearing like breadcrumbs left by a version of me that refused to stop walking. By dusk, I reached that forgotten shelter again. The same sagging roof, the same tilt of the foundation. The stream still ran behind it, whispering against the rocks like a heartbeat. But something had changed. The clearing felt occupied. The air had that dense, electric stillness before a storm. I set my pack down carefully, every movement deliberate, as though I were stepping into a memory that might shatter if I moved too quickly. Inside, the logbook was waiting in the tin box, newer pages added since my last visit. My hands trembled as I flipped through the recent entries. Hikers from a few days ago, some local names, a pair from North Carolina. Then I found it. Ethan Miles, returned April 14th. Still here. Finally ready to leave. The date matched that exact day. I remember laughing, quiet, broken, almost hysterical, because there it was again. My handwriting, my name, a note written before I'd even arrived. My mind scrambled for logic, but logic has no place in those woods. The Appalachian Trail doesn't trade in reason. It trades in echoes. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark with only the stream's voice and the faint scratching of wind against the roof. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time closer, slower, like someone dragging their boots through the wet leaves just outside the door. I gripped the knife, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to help me. You can't cut what isn't flesh. You can't fight what already knows your name. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. Then, without warning, a shadow filled the doorway. Tall, lean, familiar. I couldn't make out the face, only the shape, the same pack, the same jacket I was wearing. For a long, suspended moment, I thought I was staring into a reflection made real. "Still here," the figure said. The voice wasn't a whisper or a growl. It was my own voice, perfectly calm, perfectly steady. Then it turned slowly and began to walk toward the tree line. I don't remember deciding to follow, but my legs moved on their own. I left my gear behind, stepped into the night, and followed that shape through the fog. It led me deeper into the woods, past the stream, past the trail itself, into a part of the forest that didn't exist on any map. The ground softened under my boots, and the air thickened until I could taste the damp on my tongue. The figure stopped beside a hollowed tree, then crouched. I watched as it reached into the hollow and pulled out an old, water-damaged notebook. My notebook, the one I had burned. I felt my knees weaken. I remember whispering, "That's not possible." The figure opened the book. The pages were blackened, but the ink still glowed faintly, like embers waiting to breathe again. It looked at me and said softly, "You left before you were done." Then it vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. The logbook fell open at my feet. I don't know how long I stood there before I picked it up. The last page was blank, except for a faint outline of letters bleeding through from the next sheet. I turned it. The words were there, written in that same looping script. When the trail remembers you, you never really leave. At dawn, I found my way back to the shelter. My pack was untouched, the logbook still open on the ground. The air was clear, the forest alive again with the hum of birds. It was as if the night had never happened. But when I flipped to the newest page, my entry was already there. Same day, same words. My pen still capped. I packed up slowly, letting the forest swallow the silence again. As I hiked out, I felt lighter. Not at peace, not safe, but acknowledged. Like the trail had finally finished what it started. When I reached the parking lot, I saw another hiker just arriving. A young guy, probably in his 20s, bright eyes, big plans. He waved at me. "Hey man," he said. "You just come off the ridge?" "Yeah," I told him, forcing a smile. "Keep your wits about you up there." He grinned. "Always do." Then he opened his pack, pulled out a small leather journal, and showed me a page he'd just written that morning. My heart stuttered. My name was there. Met Ethan Miles at the trailhead. Said he just came down, heading up now. But I hadn't told him my name. I walked to my truck, hands shaking, the sun barely touching the treetops. I wanted to leave it all behind, to let the memory fade. But as I turned the key, I looked back one last time toward the tree line and saw a shape standing there. Same jacket, same pack, watching. I blinked and it was gone. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that fog, of that voice, of the trail whispering through the trees like it's calling me back. Maybe the trail doesn't haunt people. Maybe it simply remembers them, the way old places remember storms. Maybe every footprint, every carved initial, every page signed in the logbook is just another echo, waiting for the next traveler to walk the same path. And maybe one day, when someone opens that same book deep in the Appalachians, they'll find a new name written there before they even arrive. Because the trail never forgets, it only waits. The camera drifts through the fog, slow and weightless, like something searching for what's been lost. The trees move past, black trunks against gray light, each one older than the last. The faint call of a crow echoes through the valley, and beneath it a human voice rises, quiet, reflective, weary but still steady. You know, people always say the mountains are alive. They mean it in a poetic way, a thing to say when the sun hits the ridges and everything looks golden and holy. But after what I've seen, I think they mean it more literally than they realize. Out there, in the deep woods, where the maps stop meaning anything and the air grows heavy with silence, you start to feel it. The pulse, the weight, the awareness of the place. You think you're walking through it, but sometimes it's walking through you. I've tried to explain it to people back home, how a trail could know your name, how the woods could remember your steps, but their faces always twist with that polite disbelief. They nod, smile, change the subject. And maybe that's for the best, because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once you've heard the forest call your name, not in your head, not in your heart, but from the dark itself, there's no pretending it was just the wind. They say the Appalachian Trail is more than 2,000 miles long, but for me, it's become something else. It's a circle, a loop of memories that never closes, a place that keeps playing back the same story until it learns what it wants from you. And I think that's what the logbooks are, the trail's way of remembering who it touched, who it kept. When I sleep now, I still dream of it. The way the fog curled around the fire tower, the way the air smelled of rain and rust and something older than both. In those dreams, I'm always walking, always just about to reach the next shelter. And there's always a notebook waiting, always open. I don't try to run anymore. I don't burn the pages or fight the memory. I let it in. Because maybe that's the lesson the trail was trying to teach all along, that some places don't want to be conquered. They just want to be witnessed. Every trail leaves a mark. Sometimes it's dirt on your boots. Sometimes it's a scar. Sometimes it's your name written down in a book you never remember signing. But no matter how far you go, the mountains keep your shadow. They fold it into the fog and carry it forward, waiting for the day you come back to claim it. When people ask why I still hike alone, I tell them it's because the woods understand things we don't. Out there, you face the truth without mirrors. You see the part of yourself that doesn't need words, the part that belongs to something much older. And maybe that's what the message in the logbook meant all along. Still here. We'll be leaving soon. Maybe it wasn't a warning. Maybe it was a reminder that none of us really own our time here, that we all pass through the same stories, wearing different faces, leaving the same marks on the same wood. If you ever find yourself deep in those mountains and you stumble across a forgotten shelter by a stream, one that leans just a little too far into the slope, open the box in the corner, run your hand over the pages. You might see your name there. Maybe not yet, maybe not today. But the trail, it writes in advance. And if you do find it, don't be afraid. Just know that you've been there before, that the forest has seen you, that your story has already been told once, and now it's simply asking to be finished. The wind picks up, threading through the trees like a low hum, carrying the faint sound of footsteps. Mine, yours, maybe both. Because the Appalachian Trail never really lets you go. It waits, patient and eternal, breathing through the roots and the mist, watching, remembering. And if someday you hear your name whispered through the fog or find it written in a place you swear you've never been, don't run. Just listen. Because that's not the sound of something hunting you. It's the sound of the trail saying, welcome back.